They were not just warriors. They were architects of terror. The Vikings didn't conquer with swords alone. They conquered minds, bodies, and spirits, leaving behind scars far deeper than any blade could carve. What if the most feared weapon in their arsenal wasn't forged from steel, but from human intimacy itself? Imagine a world where your sexual position could decide your social rank, where one whispered insult about your masculinity could strip you of your property, your rights, and even your life. In this world, intimacy was never private. It was public, political, and as dangerous as open battle. And yet, the darkest secrets were not whispered in bedrooms or behind closed doors. They played out before entire communities, at weddings and courts, and even on funeral pyres, blending desire with death in ways so disturbing that historians once dismissed them as medieval horror stories. But the evidence says otherwise. Every shocking detail was real. A Muslim diplomat traveling through the lands of the Rus in 922 AD saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a learned and worldly man, had thought he'd seen the full spectrum of human behavior, until he witnessed a Viking funeral. Before his eyes, raiders performed intimate rituals with a young slave girl. Then, as the culmination of this macabre ceremony, they burned her alive alongside their dead chieftain. His written account reads like a scene from a nightmare, except every word was true. What you're about to hear is not legend or rumor. It is drawn from documented historical sources, eyewitness testimony, sagas, and archaeological discoveries. These records reveal how the Vikings wielded sexuality as a weapon of war, a tool for controlling their society, and, in their eyes, a bridge to the afterlife. These acts didn't merely shock. They reshaped medieval Europe and influenced ideas of power, honor, and gender that still echo into our modern world. Some of what you'll hear is so extreme that early historians assumed it was anti-Viking propaganda, exaggerations meant to smear their reputation. But dig deeper into the sagas, the law codes, and the burial mounds, and a grim truth emerges. These practices were deliberate, ritualized, and systematically enforced, from public consummations in front of family members, to sexual executions staged as entertainment, from calculated mass rapes used as psychological warfare to intimate funeral rites involving human sacrifice. Viking sexual culture was built on dominance. It was designed to maintain control, reinforce hierarchies, and ensure that power flowed in only one direction, toward those who commanded, conquered, and penetrated. The evidence reveals a society where violence and sexuality were inseparable. In Viking culture, your sexual role wasn't just about pleasure. It dictated your honor, your freedom, and sometimes your survival. The rules were as strict as the edge of a battle axe, and breaking them could destroy you. Two Viking concepts, urgi and rager, carried a death sentence in all but name. These words condemned a man as sexually passive, feminine, or submissive. To call someone rager was such a profound insult that the law itself allowed for murder and retaliation. If you killed the man who accused you, the courts would let you walk free. This created a sexual hierarchy as rigid and merciless as any medieval caste system. The active partner, the one who penetrated, retained masculine honor and respect. The passive partner lost everything: manhood, social status, legal rights, even property. In Viking society, your position in bed was directly tied to your position in life. The consequences of being labeled sexually passive in Viking society were nothing short of catastrophic. By modern standards, the laws were absurd, but to a Viking, they were the natural order of things. A man accused of being rager could lose his right to testify in court. He could be stripped of property, banned from carrying weapons, and even disqualified from inheriting land. In effect, being branded sexually submissive was a form of social execution. It removed you from the circle of free men and cast you into the shadows of dishonor. The Icelandic sagas record countless tragedies where a man's life unraveled entirely because of rumors about his bedroom role. Blood feuds often began with nothing more than an insult about one's masculinity. The saga of Burnt Njal tells of a conflict that spiraled into a full-scale vendetta, leaving dozens dead, all because one man called another unmanly. In Egil's saga, warriors rode across vast distances to kill someone who dared to question their sexual dominance. Even women knew how devastating such accusations could be, and they sometimes wielded them as weapons. The sagas describe wives publicly ridiculing their husband's sexual performance, shattering reputations in moments. One account tells of a wife who divorced her husband and ruined him socially by claiming he was too gentle in bed, a death blow to a Viking man's honor. This constant pressure to prove masculinity created a vicious cycle. Men were expected to display aggression at all times, and aggression in turn demanded further proof of dominance. This feedback loop fed into a culture where sexual violence wasn't simply an act of brutality, it was a calculated instrument of social control. The Vikings understood something chilling. Breaking a man's spirit could be more effective than killing him outright. Humiliation left wounds that never healed. The sagas describe a practice known as klamhug, the shame stroke. This was not random violence but a deliberate act of stabbing or cutting an enemy's buttocks, symbolically marking him as penetrated. It was a public branding of disgrace. And while symbolic gestures could be enough, Vikings often went further. Captured warriors, especially leaders, sometimes faced actual sexual assault in front of witnesses. This wasn't merely sadism, it was a ritual theft of power. In Viking belief, forcing an enemy into the passive role drained his masculine essence and transferred it to the victor. The psychological devastation was complete. A man subjected to such treatment could rarely return to his community with dignity. Many were shunned by their own people. Some chose suicide over the shame. Others became wandering outcasts, living reminders of Viking supremacy. Sexual enslavement was another cornerstone of Viking domination, and it was practiced on an industrial scale. The slave markets of Dublin and York overflowed with captives, many taken specifically for sexual exploitation. The sagas recount raids where human beings were divided like spoils of war, with the most physically attractive women reserved for the chieftains and elite warriors. In the Orkneyinga saga, Earl Sigurd is said to have kept an entire harem of captured Irish women, using them as though they were no more than possessions. Viking law was explicit. Free women had strong protections against sexual assault, but slaves had none. A free man could use a female slave however he wished, and killing her for resisting was barely considered a crime. The law codes were brutally clear. Raping a free woman could mean the death penalty. Raping a slave? That was treated like damaging property, punishable by a fine. Archaeological evidence from Dublin indicates that slaves may have made up nearly 30% of the population, many of them purchased or captured for sexual purposes. The message was unmistakable. In Viking society, sexual violence wasn't a byproduct of war. It was part of the battle plan. Sometimes communities surrendered without a fight simply to avoid the horrors that would follow if they resisted. The threat of sexual domination could be more persuasive than any weapon. If Viking sexual violence was meant to humiliate enemies, their wedding traditions were designed to bind entire communities together through public displays of intimacy. To modernize, these customs look less like romance and more like ritualized voyeurism. Privacy was not just rare, it could be legally suspicious. In Viking society, a marriage was not fully valid until it was consummated, and consummation often had to be witnessed, or at least confirmed, by members of the bride's family. If there was no proof that the couple had engaged in intercourse, the bride's family could demand the return of her dowry, claiming the union was null. That proof often took the form of bloodied bedsheets displayed the next morning as evidence of the bride's virginity and the marriage's success. These sheets were not simply symbolic. They could serve as legal documents in court. The law codes even specified penalties if the groom failed to perform. If a bride was not a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud. If the groom was impotent, he could be forced to pay damages for damaged goods. The wedding ceremony itself was thick with sexual symbolism. One prominent ritual involved placing Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, on the bride's lap, a fertility blessing that everyone understood carried an unmistakable phallic meaning. The hammer would then be blessed by a priest and passed among the guests to touch, turning the blessing into a communal sexual gesture thinly disguised as religion. Another public symbol was the removal of the bride's crown, an announcement that her virginity was about to be claimed. Witnesses would then escort the couple to the marriage bed, offering fertility prayers that were essentially sacred versions of sexual encouragement. Sometimes trusted relatives remained in the room to verify that the act truly took place, an uncomfortable duty immortalized in sagas like Grettir the Strong. It's hard to imagine the pressure on both bride and groom in this setting. Newlyweds were expected to perform under the eyes, and sometimes the ears, of their families. Those outside the chamber would listen for sounds that confirmed penetration had occurred. The line between sacred rite and invasive spectacle blurred until it disappeared entirely. And yet, in Viking eyes, these customs were not about romance but about law, inheritance, and political alliances. A marriage was a business contract in which sexual performance was both the seal and the signature. Love, if it existed, was incidental. This obsession with ritualized intimacy extended beyond weddings to their funerals, where sexuality was believed to carry mystical power into the next life. Viking funeral rites were some of the most shocking in human history, and no account is more disturbing than that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's description of a Viking chieftain's funeral reads less like a solemn ceremony and more like a ritualized horror, one where sex, death, and spiritual belief were fused into a single performance. For the Vikings, death was not the end, but a transition, and they believed that sexual energy could be transferred from the living to the dead, fueling the chieftain's power in the afterlife. When a high-ranking man died, his household would gather his slave girls and ask, "Which of you will die with him?" One would volunteer, not because she was forced in the moment, but because she had been raised to believe that following her master into death was the highest honor, a guaranteed passage to Valhalla as his eternal companion. From the moment she volunteered, her fate was sealed. For the next several days, she was treated as a sacred vessel, carrying the tribe's collective vitality into the afterlife. The men of the community would come to her, not as lovers, but as contributors to this macabre spiritual transfer. Each encounter was accompanied by the words, "Tell your master that I do this out of love for him." The ritual escalated day by day. The chosen woman was plied with alcohol and intoxicating herbs to dull her senses. She was passed from man to man, each representing a different facet of the chieftain's authority. Warriors for strength, merchants for wealth, elders for wisdom. Every act was believed to add another layer of spiritual energy to deliver to the dead. On the day of the funeral, the intensity peaked. The slave girl was taken to a specially prepared pavilion aboard the funeral ship. Inside, 6 men awaited her, each engaging in what the Vikings saw as a final offering. When it was done, she was laid beside her master. Then came the most chilling moment of all. An old woman known as the Angel of Death entered the pavilion. She placed a rope around the girl's neck and tightened it while simultaneously stabbing her with a ceremonial dagger. As her life ebbed away, chants rose from the crowd outside, calling upon the gods to receive the chieftain and his companion. The ship was set alight, flames consuming the bodies and sending smoke spiraling into the sky, a bridge in Viking belief to the realm of the dead. The people watching saw not a murder, but a sacred passage. The girl, they believed, was transformed into a goddess-like figure, carrying the tribe's collective power into eternity. Modern archaeology has uncovered disturbing confirmation of such rituals. The famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained the remains of 2 women, one showing signs of violent death. Across Scandinavia, other high-status burials have revealed young women laid to rest alongside powerful men, often with evidence suggesting they were killed for the ceremony. What the Vikings considered the highest honor, the modern mind recognizes as one of history's most chilling examples of sexualized ritual killing. And yet, this was not an isolated practice. It was embedded in the very fabric of their beliefs about life, death, and power. Viking society contained a paradox so sharp it could cut through any simple narrative about gender roles in the past. On one hand, free Viking women enjoyed rights and freedoms that would not be matched in many parts of Europe for centuries. On the other, enslaved women lived in conditions so dehumanizing they would horrify even the cruelest medieval rulers elsewhere. For free women, the law was surprisingly progressive, at least by the standards of the age. A wife could divorce her husband for sexual inadequacy with remarkable ease. If a man failed to satisfy her in bed, performed poorly, or displayed what she considered an unmanly approach to intimacy, she could dissolve the marriage and take her property with her. The sagas even record cases where women left husbands for wearing clothing deemed too feminine or for failing to defend their honor in public. These women could inherit land, run their own businesses, and even propose marriage. Some commanded ships, led trading expeditions, and held political influence. The saga of the people of Laxerdal tells of Un, the deep-minded, a formidable matriarch who controlled vast territories and orchestrated marriages for her male relatives, cementing her family's power. Yet the same legal framework that granted these freedoms also reinforced the absolute degradation of enslaved women. The contrast was intentional, a brutal reminder of the gulf between the free and the enslaved. A free woman could refuse any sexual advance, and the law would back her. An enslaved woman had no such protection. She was property to be used at will by any free man. This wasn't merely tolerated, it was encoded into law. While unwelcome sexual contact with a free woman could carry penalties as severe as exile or execution, the rape of a slave was treated like damage to livestock, an offense measured in monetary fines. The message was clear. Freedom was precious precisely because slavery was the ultimate degradation. By giving free women the ability to reject advances, Viking society made the lack of choice for enslaved women even more glaring, a cruel contrast that kept the social hierarchy firmly in place. Free women were not merely passive beneficiaries of the system. Some actively supported it, understanding that their own rights were bound to the continued subjugation of others. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka suggests that certain Viking women may have participated in raids, encouraging, and sometimes joining in, acts of sexual violence against enemy populations. But Viking society was not equally kind to all daughters. Female infants were often victims of exposure, left outside to die if the family deemed them a burden. The sagas mention this almost casually, revealing a cold pragmatism. Better to invest resources in sons who could fight, raid, and inherit. The result was a society in which a relatively small number of free women held significant rights and influence, while the majority of women, captives and slaves, lived lives defined by sexual exploitation, hard labor, and the constant threat of violence. When it came to sexuality, the Vikings operated by rules that seem contradictory through a modern lens. Same-sex relationships were not outright condemned. In fact, they could be socially acceptable, even celebrated, as long as one ironclad rule was followed. You had to maintain the dominant, penetrating role. The sagas contain examples of warriors who kept both wives and male lovers, treating sexual conquest, regardless of gender, as a form of collecting trophies. In Viking eyes, dominance was not about who you desired, but about who held the active role. As long as you maintained it, your masculine honor remained intact. But crossing that invisible line came with ruinous consequences. A man who took the passive role, even willingly, risked being branded ragur, sexually submissive, which was one of the most devastating accusations in Viking culture. The penalty wasn't simply social embarrassment. It could strip you of your legal rights, property, and even your life. These attitudes were reflected in their mythology. Even the gods were not immune to sexual politics. Loki, the trickster god, frequently changed form and gender, even becoming pregnant and giving birth, most famously to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. While such stories were told with humor, they also reinforced the stigma against male passivity. Odin himself was not above criticism. He practiced cedar, a powerful form of magic associated with women. This raised questions among the other gods about his masculinity. Engaging in female-coded activities, even for divine purposes, was enough to mark someone as ergi, effeminate or deviant. It created a strange paradox. The most powerful man in the Norse pantheon could also be considered sexually suspect. The Vikings encoded this complexity into their laws with chilling precision. While no statute specifically banned homosexuality, false accusations of sexual passivity were treated as one of the gravest offenses, sometimes carrying penalties as severe as murder. The reason was simple. Such an insult threatened the very core of a man's social identity. Masculine dominance had to be maintained in every sphere, in clothing, in behavior, in speech, and above all, in sexual conduct. Any deviation risked complete social destruction. This relentless pressure shaped not only intimate relationships, but the broader culture of violence, honor, and conquest. And it didn't stop at private life. The Vikings carried these sexual politics into public spectacles of justice and punishment, turning humiliation into both law enforcement and entertainment. Crimes of a sexual nature were punished in ways designed not only to harm the body, but to destroy the soul, and to let the watching crowd revel in the spectacle. For the Vikings, justice was never just about righting a wrong. It was about putting on a show. Their punishments for sexual offenses blurred the line between legal judgment and sadistic theater, transforming the suffering of the guilty into a spectacle for the entire community. Convicted rapists might themselves be subjected to sexual humiliation before being executed. The method was deliberate, to strip away their masculinity in front of a crowd, marking them with the same symbolic disgrace they had inflicted on others. Adulterers could face castration, their mutilation carried out in public with an audience that treated the event like a grim festival. But this was more than mere vengeance. These punishments reinforced the Viking social hierarchy. They were stark reminders that power belonged only to those who could maintain dominance, physically, sexually, and socially. Public humiliation became a form of cultural programming, teaching everyone to fear even the hint of sexual weakness. The sagas describe entire festivals in which captured enemies were forced to perform degrading acts for the amusement of their captors. Crowds would jeer, bet on the victim's endurance, and cheer as each torment became more elaborate. In some cases, prisoners were tortured in explicitly sexual ways until they either died or lost their sanity. The saga of the Vikings tells of such contests, where torment escalated in rounds, as if cruelty itself were a competitive sport. These were not acts of uncontrolled rage. They were orchestrated events with rules, stages, and audiences. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations of execution sites in Scandinavia reveal bodies showing ritualized mutilation far beyond what was necessary to kill. Certain cuts, piercings, and disfigurements seem designed to carry sexual symbolism, ensuring the victim's dishonor would survive even in death. This normalization of sexualized violence as public entertainment helps explain how Viking raiders could commit such calculated atrocities abroad. They were not simply unleashing chaos. They were following a deeply ingrained cultural script. In their eyes, dominance through sexual humiliation was not only acceptable, it was a mark of cunning, strength, and social mastery. By intertwining sex, violence, and power so tightly, the Vikings created a social order that thrived on fear, shame, and spectacle. It was a system where every intimate act could carry political weight, and where even love and marriage were weaponized for the sake of control. And the legacy of these beliefs did not end with the Viking Age. Their ideas about dominance, gender roles, and sexual honor bled into the cultures they conquered, leaving traces that would shape Europe's laws, customs, and notions of masculinity for centuries to come. The Viking Age is often romanticized, painted in broad strokes of adventure, exploration, and fearless warriors sailing into the unknown. Yet beneath the popular image lies a darker, more unsettling truth. The Vikings were master architects of psychological and sexual domination. They understood that power was not maintained by brute force alone. It had to be reinforced in every aspect of life, in the bedroom, in the law, in public spectacle, and even in the myths that framed their worldview. They turned intimacy into a battlefield, making sexuality a weapon as sharp and lethal as any sword. Their culture elevated dominance to a sacred duty. Masculinity was measured by one's ability to impose one's will, whether in war, politics, or the most private moments of human connection. Submission was more than weakness. It was social death. This was the driving engine behind a system that rewarded aggression and punished vulnerability with ruthless precision. The paradoxes of Viking life are striking. Free women enjoyed rights centuries ahead of their time, yet enslaved women were treated with unspeakable cruelty. Same-sex intimacy could be accepted, as long as it preserved the active-passive hierarchy. Religion and magic could be intertwined with gender norms, even as those norms were used to shame gods themselves. By normalizing sexual violence as entertainment, the Vikings ensured that future generations would inherit a worldview in which power and pleasure were inseparable. This mindset shaped the way they conquered, the way they ruled, and the way they left their mark on the lands they touched. Their legacy did not vanish with the end of the Viking Age. It seeped into the cultures of medieval Europe, influencing laws, social customs, and the unspoken rules of gender and honor. The echoes can still be heard today, in the lingering belief that dominance is strength, that vulnerability is weakness, and that control over another's body is the ultimate expression of power. So the next time you hear tales of fearless Viking explorers, remember this: their most terrifying weapon was not forged of iron or steel. It was crafted from an unflinching understanding of human nature and a willingness to use intimacy itself as a tool of conquest. What other forgotten sexual practices from history would shock the modern world? Tell me which civilization you'd like me to uncover next, and prepare yourself. Some truths are darker than any legend.